Star Wars, talking about Star Wars, nothing but Star Wars role-playing game. Alright, here we go. We're going to do a little bit of a longer video today talking about the Fantasy Flight Star Wars RPG game, and this is one that I've been diving in pretty deep for the past year. I found out about this just kind of scouring the internet. I was getting into a really big Star Wars phase at the beginning of lockdown. I was starting to read through all the original 90s novels, and I'm like, I need more. And yeah, I found out that Fantasy Flight has a role-playing game, and then just dove into the system hard. This video is going to be talking about a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, it's mainly just kind of a broad brush look at the Fantasy Flight Star Wars role-playing game. The system, how we got here, things that I like, things that I don't like. I'm not going to be talking too much about detail of the different classes and races and characters and all that kind of stuff. It's mainly just kind of like my own little impression, things that I got out of it, little tips and tricks that I have while playing this game, as well as just some kind of fun insights that I have. So I'm going to have a bunch of different segments on here, and as you can see, it's a little bit of a longer one. So let's dive into the first segment. Alright, so the history of this game. This isn't the first Star Wars game, which, I mean, makes perfect sense if you think about it. It's a property as popular as Star Wars. There's been lots of different role-playing games devised from different publishers throughout the years. The first one was published back in 1987, a good year, by the way, by West End Games to kind of commemorate the 10th year anniversary of Star Wars A New Hope. And it was based off of the West End Games previous game of Ghostbusters that uses mainly a D6. And this is also the game that gave us names for a lot of the different alien races, like the Twi'lek, the Rodian, and the Quarren first appear here. And for anybody that's a big Star Wars nerd, such as myself, when Timothy Zahn was writing his first batch of books in the 90s, his whole Thrawn trilogy, he was given the role-playing books as source material to draw for their names, so that everything was kind of canonically correct. West End Books put out 3 editions of this game, kind of 2.5, because the last book was more of a kind of expansion instead of a full other editions. They put out well over 100 source books and adventures within the decade that they had this license, from 1987 all the way to about 1998. And for the most part, the system was pretty successful within, this climate of gaming systems. From there, in the 2000s, the license was incorporated by Wizards of the Coast. And because they were also working off of the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and the 3rd edition was more of an open source that anybody can use, they modeled that game off of the D20 system that the 3rd and 3.5 of Dungeons & Dragons was using. They published 11 source books for this version between 2000 and 2010 with mild success. They also made a lot more money from the miniature games that they were putting out, because a lot of people like their kind of tactical miniature games that they were sourcing at that time. And when the license came up for renewal in 2010, they declined, saying, well, not really doing too much with Star Wars. And in the 2010s, the prequels had just finished, and Clone Wars was kind of finishing off the animated things. So there wasn't really too much in terms of the Star Wars licensing. Unfortunately, nobody told them that 2 years later, The Force Awakens would be coming out, and was it 2 years? No, it was much later than that. But The Force Awakens would come out in a number of years and then explode the franchise back into what we currently see today. So when the license came up, Final Fantasy Flight purchased the license in 2011. And from there, they began to develop their own games. But first, they kind of focused in on the miniature games, because Fantasy Flight does a lot of card games and miniature collectibles, because that's where a lot of the profits come from. But yeah, they really quickly designed and developed this game that we're currently talking about today. They decided to do something a little bit different, and they decided to do kind of a trilogy of the game. So they decided to do 3 games. The first one being Edge of the Empire, that was beta tested in 2012, and they had the full game version later on that year. And you'll actually see throughout this whole Fantasy Flight Star Wars role-playing game, they're almost obsessed with trilogizing almost everything. And that's in all of their campaign settings. And they actually recommend that when you do your own game, that it has this like 3-act arc within 3 different settings. So it's really interesting. So the next year of 2013, they beta tested and put out Age of the Rebellion. And then later on, they did Force and Destiny that was released later on that year. So by 2014, all 3 of these games had been put out. And I think later on, they put out a starter box for The Force Awakens that kind of blended a little bit all these different games, but they never got like a full source material book, like the core book for this. In terms of the setting of this game, because like Star Wars has a vast array of different settings. Like you've got the Old Republic, you've got like the Clone Wars, you have where the original trilogy took place, you have now the new world that they've constructed with The Force Awakens and the sequel movies, but you also have a plethora of like novels, an expanded and extended universe with a lot of the stuff that came out of the novels with the whole Legends series, and you have like old stuff like the old Knights of the Old Republic and all that. So where does this game setting take place? All 3 of these games take place somewhere around the destruction of the first Death Star, just after A New Hope, so that the Rebel Alliance has an actual presence in the Galactic Empire, but it's not so much that they've overthrown the Empire, so that the Empire is still a real threat. So both parties literally are warring at one another. And this kind of brings us to the next point of there are 3 games. Yeah, so there are 3 separate yet somehow connected games in here. As I mentioned, you've got Edge of the Empire, you've got Age of Rebellion, and you've got The Force and Destiny. Each game has their own source material and like core rule book, and they all have their different separate settings, flavors, and how each kind of has a little bit of a different mechanics to work through their game, but at the end of the day, they all kind of are based off of the same working mechanics. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each individual game separately and kind of the unique features that each one has in terms of the setting, which is really the main difference, and then how the rules kind of play about that. The first one being the Edge of the Empire, and it focuses more on the rough and tumble side of the Empire and the galaxy. You're playing kind of like the Han Solo style of game. This is more focusing on paying your debts, taking on smuggling operations, and trying your best not to get caught up in the whole intergalactic war that's raging right now. So this is something that would be great if you wanted to play a game that's similar to like The Mandalorian or Firefly or Farscape or something along those types of like a Western space game. The other one is the Age of Rebellion. And this one focuses much more on the actual war itself. This is much more of a war game. You're a part of the rebellion, and your main objective ultimately is to overthrow the Empire and gain as much ground as you possibly can. It focuses on gaining reputation and upping your duties, finding out why you were recruited into this war. Was it obligatory? Is it more self-motivating, or were you dragged into it kicking and screaming? One way or another, you're in the war, you're in the trenches, and you are trying to gain as much ground as you want. This is much more of a game if you want to play like a Rogue One style if we're looking at the movies, or kind of like the X-Wing series if we're looking at the books, to flesh out what war actually means. So this is more of like that space wars aspect. And finally, in Force and Destiny, this is where you're playing the Jedi. This is where the Jedis finally find their place within the whole Star Wars world. You're trying to find out more about the Jedi, what being a Jedi means, reestablishing the Jedi Order, or trailblazing a new Jedi Order. You're looking at lost temples. You're looking at bringing balance to the Force in one way, shape, or another. You're either trying to master your own skills within the Force and how to use it, or trying to use it to your own special devious ways. So you have this whole morality thing going on about, do you be more of a tool for the Force to use, or do you use the Force as your own tool to use as you will it? So this is much more of like the Space Wizards kind of version of the game. And this one's great if you just love Force powers, wielding lightsabers, uncovering lost lore, and that type of thing. This kind of comes down to the next segment, which is which is the right system to use. Which one do you really want to use? And at the end of the day, it's less on what mechanics you want to play and much more of the setting that you want to play in. And I always come down to the 3 W's or the SW's: Space Western, Space War, or Space Wizards. And that's kind of where I kind of pitch this whole thing. If you want to play Space Westerns, you got Edge of the Empire. If you want Space War, that's where you've got the Age of Rebellion. And if you want the Space Wizards, then you've got Force and Destiny. Now, they all still have a little bit of a different mechanic in terms of what's motivating them to action. So with Edge of the Empire, it's your obligation, either a debt or some kind of a bounty is on you. Within Age of Rebellion, it's much more of your duty. How much are you invested in this? And finally, in Force and Destiny, you've got morality. How much of it are you, tainted to the dark side? How much of it are you letting the Force flow through you? And so that kind of allows you to kind of dictate how your character is acting, as well as forces that are pushed upon you. Those are the 3 different games, 3 different settings that we're in. Let's actually now talk about the actual game mechanics of these 3 games. So even though I've mentioned that these are 3 different games, they all work on the same principle. I'm going to talk about the main game mechanics in terms of like how the game is played, and kind of fun things about that. So the first one is the dice pool. So as with most RPG games that you're playing on a tabletop, you're going to be rolling dice. And the thing that I love, and probably the big highlight that most people will draw towards when it's coming to these Star Wars games, is the dice pool that you create. It's based on 2 factors. First up is your character stats, what they have going for them. And the second is the environmental factors on it, or how difficult it is to complete whatever task that they're going for. Your stats give you a positive dice pool, and the environmental factors give you a negative dice pool. The dice pool in this game is very unique, and this is one of the things that I actually do love, as well as hate, about this game, is because they use a specialized dice specifically for this game. I mean, Fantasy Flight is really big on that. They use that for their Legend of the 5 Rings to pretty good success. But the dice you're rolling don't have any numerical values on it. It's symbols instead. So you've got 1 symbol on the positive side of things. You have 1 symbol for success, 1 symbol for advantage, and 1 symbol for triumph. On the negative side, you have 1 symbol for failure, 1 symbol for a setback, and 1 symbol for despair. So on both of these, you cancel out the success to failures, you cancel out the advantages and the setbacks, and finally, we'll get to the triumphs and despair in a little bit. At the end of the day, you will have 2 scores then. You'll either have a pool of successes or failures, and you'll have a pool of advantages or setbacks. Successes and failures are exactly what they say. You either succeed in what you're trying to do, or you fail. What's really interesting are these setbacks and advantages. So you could fail with an advantage, or you can succeed with a cost. And this is what I really do love about this game that other games have tried. Like Monster of the Week has, succeeding as a setback, and like different, there's a soft fail, there's a soft success. So there's like a degree to this, but this has a little bit more of a lucidity to it. Like there's a little bit more of an interpretation that you have on that. So if we're putting this in context, if I've developed a pool and I have a number of ones for, say, trying to shoot a blaster at a stormtrooper. So I've collected my positive pool based on how well I can execute this thing, and there might even be some environmental factors to boost this, because there are certain dice for a boost. I would roll all those, as well as the environmental factors. How hard is it to hit this person? How far away are they? What's the armor that they're wearing in that sense? And then I would roll those as well. So I'm rolling them all at once. Let's say I've got 3 successes, 2 failures, 2 advantages, and 3 setbacks. So we've got a pool of success as well as a pool of setbacks after everything's kind of been, canceled out. So what this means is I hit him. So I'm success in what I'm trying to do. But I've got a setback. So that can be interpreted in a number of different ways. And this is more of why they call it a narrative dice game, because now we've got a whole bunch of these different dice that are also telling us what happens. So you work with the GM at this point to kind of talk back and forth of what happens. Now, there are tables of how you spend disadvantages and advantages. And most of the time, in terms of a, mechanical sense, it just gives the next person a little bit of a boost, or gives that character a disadvantage on that, and that's represented by the 6-sided dice that you can roll. What I like to do is much more of a narrative thing. So it's like you've hit this person, but now there's more stormtroopers that know where you are, and you've given up your location, and that's where a setback dice will have occurred to you the next time you try to do something. So that's kind of how you resolve the dice pool within those kinds of checks. So now let's talk about the despair and triumphs. These do not get canceled out, and they're kind of like a success with style, and you can roll on the critical hit table if you make an attack, or the item automatically succeeds in whatever you're doing regardless of how many failures have occurred, or if it's a despair, the opposite happens. You automatically fail, and those kinds of things. Now, they do not cancel out, so if you roll both of those, something great happens as well as something bad happens. So that's where you'll count up the successes, and it also automatically gives you a success or a failure depending on what check you're trying to do. That's the general mechanics of playing this game in terms of skill checks and all like that. So now let's talk about how the combat is different. So as with most of these games, you're going to be running into combats, you're going to be running into fights, so I like how they also structure this one. For the most part, when you go to roll initiative, what you'll actually do is you'll be making a check, and if you know that this is happening, you roll your cool check. So if you're the guys that are going in to take on the big baddies, then you roll a cool. If the attack is coming at you and you're responding to it, then it's your vigilance, and you don't roll with any kind of environmentals. It's just a massive check. You count up however many successes you have. The person with the most amount of successes gets the slot first, second person gets the slot second, and any ties go to whoever has the most amount of advantages. And any ties that occur after that, it always goes to the player characters. Now, I say slots because you don't necessarily have a numerical order that you go in. You have a list, a set down list that is of PCs and NPCs. Or I guess if there's NPCs on your side, you have player characters and heroes on the one side, and then the nemesis and the baddies on the other side. And on this case, you have these slots then running down, like player character, player character, player character, NPC, NPC, player character, and that kind of thing. What this allows you to do is at the beginning of each round, you get to choose who goes in what order. So say we've got Susan and Brian and Tasha, and then the baddies get to go, and then finally Lucas, right? At the beginning of the next round, you get to choose the order again, and it could be completely different. The thing that I like about this is you can have these pressing situations and act on them first, right? So you're not waiting for your turn in order to heal somebody if you're at the bottom of the pack. But likewise, if you have something that you want to do, but you don't need to have it done right away, you can hold off and perform your action at the end. So I like the fact that this is a little bit more fluid in how you're able to do the ordering of the structure in that sense. So everything is made by checks, and you go to fire your blaster, very similar to the example that I have. You have one maneuver as well as one main action. You can sacrifice your main action to give you a secondary maneuver, but you can only ever have 2 maneuvers. Likewise, you can take on more strain to give yourself another maneuver. So a maneuver is to like a very small thing, like drawing out a weapon. You can take aim to give yourself a boost dice when you go to make the attack. You can move. You can essentially maneuver yourself around the field. Anything that you're not directly rolling a check for. And then you have your main action, which is, you know, doing your attack, doing any additional checks that you want to do, utilizing a power or a feature or some kind of an ability that you have that would take your main action to do. I don't want to get too far into that because I want, you know, I think there might be videos in the future where I'll do kind of more deep dives into like how to structure a fight and encounter and that kind of stuff. So let's just go on to other game mechanics that is kind of interesting. So next one I want to talk about that I need to continue to remember to do because I'm really bad at forgetting to do this is the destiny points. So at the beginning of every session, you roll a whole bunch of these force dice. It's a D12 with a bunch of black and white dots on them. This provides a pool of both dark side, which are the black dots, and light side, which are the white dots. Player characters can flip any white-sided dice to the dark-sided to give themselves a little bit of a boost. Think of it as like fate points, if you've ever played Fate, where you're kind of influencing the world a little bit. You're giving yourselves a little bit of a boost. You're able to upgrade different skills for yourself to give you a little bit more of a boost. So in that sense, it provides a really nice game mechanic. Now, in contrast to that, the GM can flip those light sides to dark to make things difficult for you to have. It essentially provides a balance for the whole game mechanic. So if there's something really big that the GM wants to make a little bit more difficult, they might switch it to the dark side, take a dark side and switch it over to the light to impose a little bit more difficult to you. Like a bunch of mist pops up and it's harder to see, or suddenly the cliff's edge that you're on starts to crumble and makes it harder for you to do whatever you're wanting to do. So there's always this kind of ebb and flow in terms of these destiny points providing this narrative game. I find I have to continuously remind myself to use them because if I don't, they'll kind of get lost in the wayside. So it's something that I keep having to remind myself to do. So let's go on to character creation. Okay, so I'm not going to get too far into the character creation. Basically, across all three games, each game gives you a list of races that you can pull from, and then you also have 8 classes that you can choose from. So you have the characteristics from your race and your stats from your class that you can then specialize in and gain a little bit more of a boost in. I might do a video later on, like really fleshing this out, but that's your bare bones. Now, what I really like is how each class gives you 3 specializations with talent trees. And that's the thing that I really love. At the beginning of character creation, you have a set amount of experience points that you can then spend to optimize your character a little bit from the starting. So it gives you these talent trees that gives you abilities. And what I love about the talent trees is if you know that you want to have one specific one, you have to trail the path in order to get to that one specific thing, because you kind of have to buy the ones that you need in order to get to that specific talent. So if I want to play, say, a spy in the Age of Rebellion, and I'm going to specialize in let's go for the scout. So they give you a whole bunch of these talents, and you start from the top and you work your way down based on the line. So if there's a line, you can take it as long as you have that first one. You can go laterally as well, as long as there's a line connecting it. And then sometimes you'll get to a dead end and you'll actually have to go down and over in order to get those items. So I really like how that's structured and how that's made. I think that's a really interesting and unique way of leveling up your character. And so that's pretty much all you really need to know in terms of playing this game. I might do further videos later on, but I know a lot of people have done these kind of how to play and like getting down in there. So I might not. We'll see how we're going. Let's talk about some things I love about this game that I haven't already touched upon, some things that I don't like about this game, and some of the, I don't know, miscellaneous things that don't really fall into either category that I always have in the back of my mind. But first off, let's talk about the good parts of this game. Okay, so this one is pretty lengthy, so I'm actually going to cut this one up myself so that we have, like, you know, the good part A, the good part B. And the first one of those that I want to talk about is The narrative dice mechanics. As I've already mentioned, I really love how the dice mechanics leaves the burden off of the GM to interpret the dice pool. You have an advantage or you have a setback. You either succeed or you fail. I really like that the dice help you tell the story and where it's going to go from there. There is a little bit of a learning curve, if I'm being perfectly honest, in terms of interpreting dice symbols rather than dice numbers. But once you get your head around that, it's a lot easier of canceling out one another than it is to start doing math on your fingers and things like that. So yeah, really, really do love the dice pool, and I love how Fantasy Flight is able to utilize this mechanic in that. The other thing that I love about this game, and I think it's less specific to this game and just more in general for Star Wars, is the deep lore that you have within this. You don't need to see every single film that's ever been put out for Star Wars. I mean, you don't need to see that Life Day special with the Wookiees. And you don't need to read every single book that's been put out, even though half of them now have been decanonized. Similar to D&D, you don't need to read the Silmarillion in order to play a high fantasy game. What I am saying, though, is that you have a deep and rich pool to draw upon for inspiration in terms of your campaign setting, what happens, and the types of characters that you can play and will interact with. This is both for player characters as well as DMs. Sorry, I keep saying DMs. GMs, because, there's no dungeons here. I mean, there could be. But anyway, what I also love is that there's enough breadth for you to also introduce your own lore if you want to. I mean, heck, the original RPG brought upon the race names for a lot of those races in the Star Wars universe. Might as well be doing that yourself. So this allows you not only a rich pool to draw upon, as I already mentioned before, but also gives you the authority and the ability to create your own rich lore if you want to. So yeah, both of those dynamics is really, really fun to play with. So what I mean when I say there's a lot of books that you can draw influence from, I'm talking about the Fantasy Flight books that they've published, because they've published a lot. You've got a separate book for each character class. You have a plethora of campaign settings and campaign guides. So if you are that type of person that loves to just dive in and read all that you can to make the best game that you can, there are a lot of resources for this game, because at the end of the day, Fantasy Flight wants to make their money, and there's kind of one of the main drawbacks to this game that I'll touch upon a little bit later on, but just kind of putting that in your head there. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of the things that I love about this game, because there's quite a bit, is the skill trees when it comes to your abilities. I really, really do love this idea that when you're leveling up, because unlike other games, the whole party doesn't level up all at once, and then suddenly you're barraged with all these new abilities and all these new things. At the end of each session, the GM... There we go. The GM awards a certain amount of experience points, anywhere between 5 to 20, sometimes 30, if you've overcome something really, really big. You can either pool those experience points to just dump a whole bunch of points throughout your character, or you can slowly pick away and level up your character. And one of the ways that you can do that is through the skill tree. And I love this idea that your character is slowly becoming better, because really, in real life, when do you suddenly realize that you can do these amazing things? Sometimes that happens, but relatively, it's these slow increments that you don't realize have this massive impact until you look back at where you have come from. So I really like that it kind of mirrors a little bit better kind of the real life progression of a character. And how it marks off these milestones. So I really love the idea of leveling up your character in that sense as a general progression, rather than these massive milestones that then create this almost completely different person based on what you're able to do. Let's move on to some of the things that I'm not so keen on this game. Okay, so nothing's really without criticism. And first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the books themselves. And first off the bat, I'm sure most people wouldn't be bothered with this. I know it's just me and my own little world that I'm in, but the game has an issue with pronouns that I know people right now that have been watching this kind of got their ears in a tinge, but all the pronouns in this book when they're referring to players and DMs and GMs and all that, it's always masculine. It's always he. Like, for example, the character finds himself embroiled in a life of adventure through no fault of his own. He could have been captured by pirates, etc., etc., etc. That was on page 38 of the Edge of the Empire core rulebook. So all the pronouns are in he. Now that is pretty limiting if you do not identify as a man. Puts a little bit of a bad flavor in your mouth because you don't necessarily see yourself in the game right from the core rules. And I find Fantasy Flight and a lot of game systems have these blinders on that their players don't necessarily look like them. So a lot of these people will design games for themselves without realizing that they have an audience much wider than just them. And that is throughout all of the books and all of the source materials throughout this entire game. I don't know, it's such an easy fix. It's such an easy fix. All you have to put is they. That's it. All you have to put is they or you. Perfect. Non-gendered, inclusive, it's great. It's perfect. The other thing that I do, it's a little nitpick for me, is that the game assumes that the player has a plethora of lore knowledge behind them, specifically when addressing ships. And this is found within a lot of the core books. If you have no idea what a YT 1300 light class freighter is, there's no picture to give you any kind of an idea of what it is. Now, for those big Star Wars fans, you're all typing, well, of course, that's the Millennium Falcon. Yeah, but not everybody knows that that's the class of ship that it is. Now, it gives all the specs and all the credentials of it, but you gotta sometimes want to picture what it is that you're dealing with. And it's interesting. On the flip side of that, there's a lot of almost unnecessary information in a lot of these core books. There's a whole section dedicated to the makeup of the galaxy in terms of the political ruling in the Edge of the Empire. And you don't really need to know about it. You don't need to know about the rise and fall of Palpatine. You don't really need to know about the political climates on a lot of these different planets. I don't know, it just feels a little bit out of place in most of these books where there's a lot of these other information that would be good to know if you're playing in other editions of this game. But the way that they set it out as 3 separate games, there's a lot of information that you don't really need to know. And this kind of goes to my main concern of this game, which is the game doesn't need to be broken into 3 different games. And I know I'm not the only person to state that. Financially, this is where we're talking about the whole financial aspect of the Fantasy Flight games. This is brilliant because it forces players to buy 3 different games to play one single game if they want the full, well-rounded aspect of it. This is something that I've always been thinking about. Like, why put out 3 different games when you could have put out the core rule books for the one game and then all these different source materials for the 3 different games? But I don't know, I'm not working at Fantasy Flight. But again, monetarily, it makes a lot of sense. Gameplay-wise, it's a little, I don't know. Now, if I'm talking a little bit more about like the actual mechanics of this game and less about, you know, the whole books aspect of it, sometimes the narrative dice does get a little bit in the way of the story, and sometimes it can be a little bit of a challenge to interpret the dice roll, especially when you do not fail or succeed but have this massive pool of advantages that you don't know what to do with. Most of the time, it just allows another person to roll again, but again, if you don't fail or succeed, but you have a whole bunch of advantages or threats at your hand, I don't know, it's really hard sometimes to interpret some of those dice, even though the books do a really good job of like putting out all these different tables of how to spend your threats or advantages. But again, sometimes those don't really make sense in whatever it is that you're trying to do. Like, what happens if you're trying to jump over a chasm and you don't fail or succeed, but you have a whole bunch of threats now on your hands? What does that mean? Are you trapped in midair? So it's one of those kinds of things that you have to play a little bit looser about the game rules in that sense. And some of the things that I'm not a big fan about this game is that they do try to incorporate each aspect or elements in all 3 games that do feel a little bit out of place, like the whole obligation aspect finding its way as morality and duty. don't quite fit as well mechanically in the other two games. Morality works a little bit in how it's influenced by the Force, but the duty, I don't know, that one's a little bit harder. I love the mechanic of obligation and how it shows up in gameplay within Edge of the Empire, but how it manifests itself in duty in Age of Rebellion is a little awkward, if I'm being perfectly honest. There's also a massive buy-in in terms of monetarily if you want to get into these games. And this is just something that I usually have when a company puts out a core rulebook rather than a player's handbook, a dungeon master or a game master's book, and then other supplementary material, and just combine it all into one more expensive book. It's a lot harder for a casual player to buy into this unless you know that you're going to be playing a full campaign into it. You want to test it out. There's a lot of a buy-in, especially when it comes to more of the dice. Like, you're spending well over $100 if you want the core rulebook and the dice to play this game. Now, they do give you the option of the starter boxes, which I really do enjoy. It gives you the dice. It gives you a really player-friendly beginner game for game masters such as myself and players to play through. It gives you tokens and character sheets, and it breaks it down very, very easily. But once you get past that initial buy-in, you still have to buy the full core rulebook if you want to flesh out your game. Again, this is one of those, monetarily, it makes a lot of sense, but getting down and playing the game for the player, it's definitely a drawback, especially when there's so much to do. And I mean, if you're made of money and you're able to make it rain, it's great. But if you're like me and you have a very limited budget, you have to, figure out where your hobbies are. It can be a little bit of a tedious uphill climb in that sense. So those are the main hang-ups that I have about this game. They're pretty minimal at the end of the day, but just some things that I've kept in the back of my mind. Let's talk about some things that are neither good nor bad. They're kind of, if this is like the good, the bad, and the ugly, this is kind of like the ugly side of things, or the miscellaneous. So I already mentioned the price barrier about this game. Again, it's hard to find these games, and a lot of these books are actually discontinued, which drives up the price for secondhand stuff. And that's also kind of where I'm in this, kind of phase of all the supplementary books. And this all ties in with the whole monetary stuff. If I want to play like a really fleshed out bounty hunter, I can also pick up a bounty hunter's book. I mean, I've got a couple of them here for the Age of Rebellion that I have in my collection. All my Edge of the Empire game stuff is all in the dining room because I'm currently playing through an Edge of the Empire game. You've got like a lot of supplementary material that at the end of the day costs quite a bit of money. But on the upside to this, if you do have that money to spend, it provides a really great source material for you. Like, if we're putting this in the Dungeons & Dragons context, because a lot of people do, if you want to play a bard, you have a full book now to draw inspiration from to play a bard. If you want to play a cleric, a full book dedicated just for clerics. And instead of having to wait for like Xanathar's Guide to Everything, or Volo's Guide to Monsters, or Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft for player material that's put out maybe once every other year or so, you don't have to wait. There's books churning out left, right, and center. The other thing is with the dice pool, because they're using your own specialized dice, all those dice that you've been collecting for all your other games, mainly Dungeons & Dragons, they can't be used here, or at least they can, and they've got these other tables that you can then convert to the successes, failures, and all that. So I don't know. That's kind of, it's both good and bad. I mean, it forces you to buy more things from them, so at the end of the day, it's kind of a good thing for them. But this kind of comes down to my next segment, which is what I would have done differently. So, okay, if I were put as the head of Fantasy Flight Games right at the beginning of 2011 when they first acquired the license, I still love the system too much to just, let the baby go with the bathwater. But here's what I would have done. Because there's so much of an overlap between these three games, it's foolish to have them as three separate games. Really, what you should have done is put out one core rulebook with all the mechanics and all the things that are in here. Have obligation kind of be an overarching thing, because I think it's great. And then releasing the campaign guides and the source materials for setting your game at the Edge of the Empire, for the Act of Rebellion, and the Force and Destiny. This way you have these kind of top-down tiers in order to play the game so that a casual player can pick up the player's handbook, have a great entry point for the game itself, and allow them to essentially go from there at what kind of a flavor you would have done. Also, because there's a lot of overlap in terms of like the races, have the one book have maybe about 8-10 popular races to choose from, as well as 10 to 8 different classes to choose from, as the mechanic is found in a lot of the different games. You know, a smuggler is found a little bit. You have like the hired gun that could be found in a lot of those, the ace that could be found in a lot of those. So you can kind of synthesize a lot of these different characters and then put out other materials for, if you want specifically the Edge of the Empire, here's a whole bunch of more classes and races to play in there. If you want the Age of Rebellion. And then from there, you can release other setting books for the Edge of the Empire, Age of Rebellion, and Force of Destiny. Same as what they're doing with the Dawn of Rebellion and Rise of the Separatists that they're currently putting around the Clone Wars. So that's kind of what I would have done for this game from the get-go. From there, I want to give some advice. So as I've mentioned, I've run through a game of Edge of the Empire with a couple of my friends. I've played through all the different starter boxes because, again, this is my one main hobby. And so there's a lot of different advices for each. And like the main advice that I can have is start off with a starter box. They're great. I really, really do love them. I might do like a full review of them later on. The other advice that I can give as a blanketed statement before I go specifically for the GMs and specifically for the players is don't forget those destiny points. I always forget about them, flipping from the one to the other. Just don't forget them. They're there. They're to be used. So yeah, now I'm going to talk a little bit about advice for the GMs. So for GMs, have a sheet for your players ready with each of the symbols on them and what it means and how you can spend advantages and disadvantages. I spent a lot of time working with my players, interpreting the dice pools. What does each symbol mean? What does that one mean? How can I spend my different things that have occurred? And honestly, the starter box has the character sheet with the different symbols and how you can spend those advantages. And that saved a lot of time in the long run. So just having a really one-page summary available for each of the players is really, really good tip, especially for players that are first starting off. Roll your obligation, your duty, and your morality at the end of the game instead of at the beginning for the next session. This allows you a good time to plan and prep, especially for obligation, how that's going to manifest itself in the next game. And it also allows the person to kind of shake in their boots of how this is going to manifest itself in the next game. Also, encourage your players to think outside the box in terms of spending their advantages and or threats. Don't limit them to whatever it is that you put on that spreadsheet or whatever you found in the books. Allow them to kind of come up with their own ideas. Work with them. It's a very big collaborative game in that sense, and never say no. It's always a yes and. And also, this is something that I've been doing. Allow your player characters to flip destiny points either way. Don't just limit them to flipping it from the light side to the dark. Allow them to flip it from the dark to the light as well. Give themselves a little bit of a setback. Give themselves a little bit of a harder difficulty setting to allow them to incur the fantasy points, the destiny points, because as a GM, you've got a lot on your plate already. Delegate a little bit. Give that back to the players, because if you find that you've accidentally hoarded a whole bunch of dark side points, you can just flip that back and be like, hey, players, do whatever you want. Set balance back into the Force in that sense. So those are some of the kind of advice that I would have for the GMs. Let's talk about a little bit of the advice that I would have for players. So for players, play into your backstory. This game is so good in providing a very structured and playable backstory for you. Allow yourself to really invest yourself into those backstories and have it show up into the game itself. Work with your GM in that sense. Also, don't worry about knowing all the Star Wars lore. As I already mentioned, you don't need to read the entire Silmarillion to play Dungeons & Dragons. It's a great resource for you to pull from when creating your own character. Like, I created a full character based off of this book here, The Crystal Star by Vonda N. McIntyre, based on Princess Leia's character, where she takes on the guise of a bounty hunter to rescue her kids. I think it's a great resource and tool that you can draw from to grab inspiration from, but don't let that intimidate you. And like I mentioned with the GM, use those advantages and disadvantages in fun and creative ways. Just because it's a disadvantage for you right now, that actually might lead to something really, really great in the long run. My one really, really good friend Simon would always say when playing Fate or Dresden Files, James Bond would be so boring if he never got captured by the bad guy. Like, think of how much fun it was to watch James Bond get out of the bad guy's big captured lair and like being antagonized by that. So don't let those setbacks throw you for a loop. Use those to your advantage to create a really compelling story. So, final thoughts of this game. So, Star Wars is slowly, I shouldn't even say slowly, but it's becoming more and more popular within the tabletop role-playing games. The plethora of books and the rise of the franchise as a whole is skirting more and more people to know about and play within this style. It combines a fail-success dice pool with a fun narrative twist that gives enough creative randomness for an interesting narrative changes for the game. It's definitely fast becoming one of my favorite systems to play in, not only because I've dove deep within the Star Wars lore over the course of the lockdown that we've had within the past year and a half. It's satisfying for both the Star Wars fans and non-fans alike. I think there's enough crunch for a very specialized character, but enough wiggle room to create something very, very unique and fancy. It's powered by a very simplistic system that once that learning curve is taken, it's a very fun and unifying aspect. And there's very little math, which as a dyslexic as myself, that's a-okay on that sense. I'm still not sure how I feel about the whole splitting up the game into different facets and different areas. I think they could have done that a little bit better. Overall, at the end of the day, this game is very fast-paced, fun, with lots of twists and turns that don't just come from the plot, that also comes from their own characters' decisions and within the narrative scope as it is. And I've also found that I've been having a blast just reading through all the different source materials and playing it for myself. I think this is a great system and one that could be developed into something even better if they decide to continue on with it. And it's interesting to see where they're going to go from here, seeing a lot of these different source materials coming out specifically for the Clone Wars. I would really like to see some things for like the Knights of the Old Republic, specifically within the games, and pushing it further into the future. Especially now that we have all this like rich lore within like the 90s books and more into where we are with The Force Awakens and those. So yeah, give it a try. Let me know what you thought. And that's kind of what I've got within this whole big spiel of a video. I probably should have broken this into smaller chunks and segments, but what are you going to do? This is my channel. I can do what I want. I might go back and revisit some of the areas that I've already talked about in a little bit more of a greater depth. But for the most part, that's what I've got. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you've stayed around for the entirety of this. And that's what I've got. That's what I've got. Thank you all so much for watching. I've been having a blast diving in, talking about it, and finding out all the different nooks and crannies of this game. And I can't wait to play more. So, until next time, may you always roll high or have a dice pool that is more offset with advantages than disadvantages. And yeah, I guess may the Force be with you. Take care.